Welcome, dear listener, to this journey through the frosted record of history. Picture yourself settling in for a moment of quiet reflection as we venture into a time when winter was not merely a season, but a trial of endurance that tested the very limits of human survival. Medieval winters were harsh beyond our modern understanding. These were not the winters of heated homes and insulated walls, of grocery stores stocked with fresh produce year-round, or of medical care when illness arose. No, these were winters that arrived like an unforgiving demon, stalking through villages and castles alike, claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. Imagine, if you will, the first signs of winter's approach in a medieval village. The leaves have long since fallen, and now the sky hangs heavy with the promise of snow. The peasants hurry to complete their final preparations, knowing that once winter's grip tightens, there will be no respite until spring's distant return. The medieval calendar was divided not by our modern convenience of central heating and electric lights, not even close, but by the harsh reality of survival. Winter meant retreating indoors for months and months at a time, huddled around tiny fires that provided crucial warmth while filling cramped living spaces with choking fumes. Food preservation was a matter of life and death. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on smoking, salting, and drying to preserve what meager sustenance they could. But even these methods had their limits. The salt used was often impure and expensive, the smoking process required constant attention, and dried foods became monotonous and nutritionally deficient. The wealthy might feast on salted pork and dried fruits, but for the common folk, winter meals consisted largely of whatever grain could be stored from the harvest. Bread became harder and more precious as supplies dwindled. Vegetables existed only in pickled or dried form, lacking the vitamins necessary to ward off scurvy and other diseases. Water itself became a challenge. Wells froze solid, forcing people to melt snow or ice for drinking water. But this process required precious fuel, creating a constant tension between the need for hydration and the need for warmth. The cold was relentless and invasive. Medieval homes were poorly insulated structures with gaps between boards and crude window coverings that did little to keep out the bitter wind. Floors were often dirt, which absorbed moisture and created a perpetually damp environment that chilled inhabitants to the bone. Families would crowd together in single rooms, sharing body heat with their livestock. Yes, animals were often brought indoors during the harshest months, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. A cow or pig represented valuable resources that could not be allowed to freeze to death. But the cold brought more than discomfort. It brought disease. Respiratory ailments flourished in the close, damp quarters where families spent their winter months. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and countless other maladies swept through communities with devastating efficiency. The elderly and the very young were particularly vulnerable, often failing to see spring's return. Chilblains and frostbite were common afflictions. Imagine the agony of fingers and toes so cold they turned black, the flesh literally dying from exposure. Medieval medicine had little to offer beyond amputation, performed without anesthesia in unsanitary conditions. The psychological toll was equally severe. Months of confinement in dark, cramped spaces took their toll on the human spirit. Seasonal affective disorder, though unnamed, was a very real phenomenon. Depression and despair settled over communities like a heavy blanket, sometimes leading to violence or madness. Fuel was a constant concern. Firewood had to be gathered and stored before winter's arrival, and the amount needed was staggering. A single household might require several cords of wood to survive a harsh winter, and the poorest families often found themselves choosing between warmth and food. The wealthy had their struggles too, though different in nature. Even the grandest castles were drafty, uncomfortable places in winter. Tapestries hung on walls not merely for decoration, but as desperate attempts to block the cold wind that whistled through stone corridors. Great fireplaces consumed enormous amounts of wood while heating only a small area immediately in front of them. Medieval winters brought a unique form of isolation. Snow-blocked roads meant that communities became cut off from the outside world for months at a time. News traveled slowly if at all, and help from neighboring villages was often impossible to obtain. The very concept of time changed in winter. Without clocks, people relied on the sun to mark the hours, but winter days were short and often grey. The long nights seemed endless, filled only with the sound of wind and the crackling of fires. Clothing offered little protection against the cold. Wool was the primary material, but it was often coarse and poorly woven. The wealthy might have fur-lined garments, but even these provided limited warmth compared to modern winter wear. Layers were essential, but many people simply didn't own enough clothing to layer effectively. The very architecture of medieval times was ill-suited to winter survival. Windows were small and often lacked glass, covered instead with oiled cloth or shutters that blocked out light along with the wind. Chimneys were primitive, often allowing more heat to escape than they retained. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the complete helplessness in the face of truly severe weather. A blizzard could bury a village for days or weeks, trapping inhabitants without means of escape or communication. People died mere feet from their doors, lost in whiteout conditions. The mortality rates during medieval winters tell a grim story. It was not uncommon for a village to lose 10% or more of its population during a particularly harsh winter. The very old and very young were most vulnerable, but even healthy adults could succumb to the combined effects of cold, hunger, and disease. Medieval winters were not just cold, they were a comprehensive assault on human survival. They tested every aspect of medieval society, from food storage and distribution to social bonds and community support. Those who survived did so through a combination of careful preparation, community cooperation, and sheer determination. Yet in the midst of this hardship, there was also a kind of beauty. The long winter nights were times for storytelling, for sharing the oral traditions that bound communities together. Families would gather around the fire, spinning tales of heroes and adventures, keeping alive the cultural heritage that sustained them through the darkest months. As we drift off to sleep in our comfortable, heated homes, let us pause to appreciate the extraordinary challenges our ancestors faced. Their struggle against the brutal medieval winter was nothing short of heroic, a testament to the resilience and determination of the human spirit. The medieval winter was more than a season. It was a test of survival that shaped entire civilizations. It forced innovations in food preservation, architectural design, and community organization. It taught hard lessons about preparation, cooperation, and the preciousness of life itself. So tonight, as you rest in warmth and comfort, remember those who came before us, who faced the brutal medieval winter with courage and determination. Their struggles remind us of how far we have come, and their perseverance offers inspiration for whatever challenges we may face in our own lives. Now that you understand the devastating impact medieval winters had on every aspect of life, let's delve deeper into how these brutal conditions shaped the very fabric of medieval society and influenced developments that would echo through history. The harsh realities of winter created a ripple effect that extended far beyond mere survival. These seasonal challenges fundamentally altered how communities organized themselves, how they planned for the future, and how they related to one another. The specter of winter loomed over every decision made during the warmer months, creating a society perpetually preparing for the next cold season. Agricultural practices evolved specifically around winter preparation. The three-field system that dominated medieval farming wasn't just about crop rotation. It was about maximizing yields before winter struck. Peasants would work frantically during harvest time, knowing that every grain saved could mean the difference between life and death when the snows came. The concept of fallowing fields wasn't merely about soil health. It was a calculated risk in a world where storing enough food for winter was a matter of life and death. The social implications were equally profound. Winter created a natural hierarchy of survival that reinforced the feudal system. Lords and nobles, with their stone castles and vast food stores, could weather the harsh months in relative comfort. Meanwhile, peasants huddled in their drafty hovels, burning furniture when firewood ran out, eating bark when grain stores were depleted. This stark contrast during winter months served as a brutal reminder of social position and reinforced the power structures that defined medieval society. Religious practices also adapted to winter's harsh realities. The church calendar strategically placed major celebrations during the darkest months. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas all fell during winter's grip. These weren't merely spiritual observances but psychological necessities, providing hope and communal gathering during the most isolating time of year. The promise of salvation and eternal spring in the afterlife held particular appeal for people suffering through months of cold, hunger, and darkness. Winter also drove technological innovation, though progress was painfully slow. The development of better heating systems, improved building techniques, and more efficient food storage methods all stemmed from the desperate need to survive the cold months. The gradual introduction of chimneys, the refinement of smoking and salting techniques, and the evolution of warmer clothing all represented humanity's ongoing battle against winter's brutality. Perhaps most significantly, medieval winters shaped the very concept of time and seasonal thinking that would influence European culture for centuries. The dramatic contrast between summer abundance and winter scarcity created a cyclical worldview that emphasized preparation, conservation, and community cooperation. This seasonal mentality would later influence everything from economic planning to artistic expression. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Living through medieval winters required a particular kind of mental fortitude, the ability to endure months of privation while maintaining hope for spring's return. This bred a resilience and stoicism that became hallmarks of medieval character. People learned to find joy in small things: a warm fire, a shared meal, a story told by firelight. These simple pleasures took on profound meaning when set against winter's harsh backdrop. Medieval winters also created unique forms of community bonding. When survival depended on mutual aid, neighbor helping neighbor became more than just courtesy, it was necessity. The practice of winter visiting, where families would gather in the largest, warmest house to share resources and companionship, created social bonds that lasted well beyond the cold season. These gatherings weren't just about conserving heat and food, they were about maintaining sanity and hope during the darkest months. The economic implications rippled through every aspect of medieval life. Markets would shut down, trade routes would become impassable, and entire industries would hibernate until spring. This seasonal economic cycle meant that wealth had to be stored and managed differently than in our modern world of year-round commerce. Success wasn't measured just in gold or land, but in how well one could prepare for and survive the winter months. As we reflect on these medieval winters, we gain profound appreciation for the strength and ingenuity of our ancestors. They faced challenges that would overwhelm most modern people, yet they persevered, adapted, and even found ways to thrive. Their experiences remind us that human resilience knows no bounds, and that even in the darkest, coldest times, the human spirit can endure and emerge stronger. The legacy of these brutal winters lives on in our cultural memory, in our seasonal celebrations, in our instinct to prepare and preserve. When we gather with family during the winter holidays, when we appreciate the warmth of our homes, when we marvel at a well-stocked pantry, we echo the ancient rhythms of survival that our medieval ancestors knew so intimately. Their struggles with winter's fury ultimately taught humanity invaluable lessons about preparation, community, and the precious nature of warmth, food, and shelter. Lessons that resonate even today. Looking at this progression of winter and its brutal challenges, the true scope of medieval suffering becomes even more apparent when we consider just how ill-equipped people were to handle these seasonal extremes. But winter wasn't just about cold temperatures and snow. It represented a complete transformation of medieval life, turning every aspect of existence into a desperate struggle for survival. The medieval calendar was ruthlessly divided into two fundamental seasons: the growing season and the dying season. Winter fell squarely into the latter category, and for good reason. As autumn faded and the first frost appeared, medieval communities would begin their grim preparations for what many considered a form of seasonal purgatory. Food preservation became a matter of life and death. Without refrigeration or modern canning techniques, medieval people relied on methods that were often unreliable and sometimes dangerous. Salt was precious and expensive, meaning that only the wealthiest could properly preserve their meat. Most peasants had to make do with smoking, drying, or burying their food in root cellars that frequently flooded or froze solid. The salted pork that sustained many families through winter was often rancid by February. The preserved vegetables had turned to mush. The grain stores, if they hadn't been raided by rodents or ruined by moisture, were running dangerously low. This created what historians call the hunger gap, that terrible period between February and May when last year's harvest was exhausted but this year's crops hadn't yet matured. During these months, medieval people would eat anything they could find. Tree bark was ground into flour. Leather was boiled into a gelatinous soup. Grass and weeds were gathered from beneath the snow. The wealthy might have enough stored food to last, but for the peasantry, winter starvation was a very real possibility. But hunger was just one aspect of winter's brutality. The cold itself was a relentless enemy that medieval architecture was poorly equipped to combat. Most peasant homes had no chimneys, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. This meant that fires had to be kept small to avoid filling the house with smoke, providing minimal warmth against the bitter cold. Windows, if they existed at all, were covered with oiled cloth or animal bladders that provided little insulation. The wealthy might have had glass windows, but even these were thin and offered poor protection against the elements. Most people simply shuttered their windows entirely during winter, living in near total darkness for months at a time. Sleep became a communal affair out of necessity. Families would huddle together in bed, sharing body heat and whatever blankets they possessed. Children often slept with their parents, and sometimes even livestock were brought indoors to provide additional warmth. Privacy was a luxury that winter simply didn't allow. The psychological toll of medieval winters was immense. The combination of hunger, cold, darkness, and isolation created perfect conditions for what we might now recognize as seasonal depression. Medieval people called it melancholia, and they understood it to be one of winter's most dangerous weapons. Religious communities tried to combat this spiritual darkness with increased prayer and fasting. But for many, winter felt like a divine punishment. The long nights seemed endless, broken only by the weak light of expensive candles or smoky rushlights that provided minimal illumination. Work didn't stop just because it was winter, though it became infinitely more difficult. Farmers still had to care for their animals, often breaking ice on water troughs multiple times per day. Craftsmen worked with numb fingers in unheated workshops. Women continued to cook, clean, and tend to children despite the harsh conditions. Travel during winter was extremely dangerous, often impossible. Roads became impassable quagmires of mud and ice. Rivers froze over, cutting off trade routes. Communities became isolated for months at a time, unable to send for help if disaster struck. This isolation meant that medical emergencies during winter were often death sentences. A broken bone, a difficult childbirth, or a serious illness that might have been treatable in summer became fatal when no help could reach the victim. Many medieval people simply accepted that winter would claim some members of their community, and they planned accordingly. The wealthy had their own winter challenges, though they were certainly better equipped to handle them. Castle life during winter was marginally more comfortable, but even nobles suffered from the cold and darkness. Great halls might have massive fireplaces, but they were expensive to maintain and often filled the rooms with smoke. Medieval warfare typically ceased during winter, not out of any seasonal goodwill, but because it was simply too difficult to move armies and supply them in the harsh conditions. However, this didn't mean that winter was peaceful. Desperate people sometimes turned to banditry, and conflicts over scarce resources could turn violent. The return of spring was celebrated with an intensity that modern people can barely comprehend. The first green shoots appearing through the snow, the return of migratory birds, the lengthening days. These weren't just pleasant changes but literal signs of salvation. Communities that had survived another winter felt they had cheated death itself. Medieval winters shaped not just individual lives but entire cultures. The Nordic concept of hygge, the English tradition of wassailing, the Germanic celebration of the winter solstice. All of these cultural practices emerged as ways to find light and warmth in the darkest season. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people developed a fatalistic acceptance of winter's brutality that bordered on the philosophical. They understood that suffering was temporary but inevitable, that community support was essential for survival, and that the promise of spring made even the darkest winter bearable. This cyclical understanding of hardship and renewal became deeply embedded in medieval thinking, influencing everything from agricultural practices to religious beliefs to artistic expression. Winter wasn't just a season to be endured, it was a fundamental part of the human experience that taught resilience, community, and hope. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval winters, the season represented far more than just cold weather. It was a test of human endurance that shaped the very foundations of medieval society, creating bonds of mutual dependence and shared suffering that would define communities for generations to come. The villagers had exhausted their meager winter stores by early February. What little grain remained in their stores was now carefully rationed, with families receiving only enough for a thin gruel that barely sustained life. The preserved meat from the autumn slaughter was long gone, and even the root vegetables stored in underground cellars had begun to rot or freeze solid in the unforgiving cold. But perhaps most cruel of all was the way winter transformed even the simplest tasks into monumental challenges. Drawing water from the well became a battle against ice that formed overnight, requiring peasants to break through thick layers with whatever tools they could find. The well bucket would freeze to the rope, and the water itself would begin to crystallize before they could carry it back to their hovels. Firewood, the precious commodity that meant the difference between survival and death, became increasingly scarce as winter dragged on. What had seemed like adequate stores in November were woefully insufficient by January. Families faced impossible choices: burn more wood to stay warm and risk running out entirely, or conserve fuel and endure the bone-chilling cold that could claim the young, the old, and the infirm. The cold was so intense that it penetrated every aspect of daily life. Ink would freeze in whatever crude writing implements existed, bread would turn rock hard within minutes of being removed from the fire, and even ale would develop a thin layer of ice. Sleep became fitful and dangerous, as families huddled together for warmth, knowing that anyone who strayed too far from the communal body heat might not wake up. For those already weakened by months of inadequate nutrition, winter was often fatal. The combination of cold, hunger, and the spread of respiratory illnesses in cramped, poorly ventilated homes created a perfect storm of mortality. Village graveyards would see their busiest season during these harsh months, though often the ground was too frozen to dig proper graves, forcing families to store bodies until spring thaw allowed for burial. The psychological toll was equally devastating. The endless grey days, the constant hunger, the fear of not surviving until spring, all of this weighed heavily on minds already burdened by the daily struggle for existence. Some would fall into deep melancholy, unable to muster the will to continue the fight for survival. Others would become irritable and prone to conflicts that could fracture the community bonds so essential for making it through the dark months. Yet even in these darkest times, medieval peasants displayed remarkable resilience. Communities would band together, sharing what little they had. Neighbors would take turns hosting small gatherings where families could pool their meager fuel resources and share body heat. Stories would be told to distract from the hunger pangs, and songs would be sung to lift spirits during the longest nights. The church, despite its role in perpetuating the feudal system that kept peasants in poverty, did provide some comfort during winter months. The promise of salvation and a better afterlife gave meaning to suffering, and the communal nature of religious observance provided social connection during isolating times. Saints' feast days offered brief respites from the grinding routine of survival, moments when even the poorest might share in slightly better food or small celebrations. Children, perhaps surprisingly, often adapted better to winter hardships than adults. Their smaller bodies required less food, and their natural resilience allowed them to find joy even in the bleakest circumstances. They would play games with scraps of wood or cloth, tell stories, and find wonder in the way frost formed patterns on walls or the sound wind made through the thatch. Women, who bore much of the responsibility for managing household resources, became the unsung heroes of winter survival. They would carefully stretch every scrap of food, mend and remend clothing to maintain whatever warmth it could provide, and nurse family members through illness with whatever folk remedies they possessed. Their ability to make something from nothing often determined whether a family would see spring. The isolation of winter also meant that help from outside the immediate community was virtually impossible. Roads became impassable, and travel was so dangerous that news from even neighboring villages might not arrive for months. This isolation forced communities to become completely self-reliant, depending entirely on whatever resources they had managed to accumulate before winter set in. As winter finally began to loosen its grip in early spring, the survivors would emerge from their hovels pale, gaunt, and weakened, but having endured one of humanity's greatest tests. The first signs of warming weather, a patch of ground visible through melting snow, the sound of water beginning to flow again, the earliest green shoots pushing through the earth, were greeted with a joy that those who have never faced such hardship could barely comprehend. The medieval winter was indeed brutal, a season that tested every aspect of human endurance and community bonds. It shaped not only individual character but entire cultural attitudes toward preparation, community cooperation, and the preciousness of life itself. Those who survived these winters carried with them a hard-won wisdom about resilience, the importance of planning ahead, and the vital necessity of supporting one another through the darkest times. In this way, winter became both destroyer and teacher, claiming many lives while forging the survivors into people of extraordinary toughness and resourcefulness. The lessons learned during these harsh months would be passed down through generations, creating cultural values of thrift, community support, and preparation that would define medieval society and echo through history long after the feudal system itself had crumbled away. But even as communities drew together during the endless winter nights, sharing what little warmth and food they possessed, the psychological toll of medieval winters was profound and lasting. The perpetual darkness, The bone-deep cold that never seemed to leave, and the constant spectre of death created a mental landscape as harsh as the physical one. Depression was not understood as we know it today, yet it manifested in countless ways throughout these frozen months. The lack of sunlight, something we now know to be crucial for mental health, created what medieval people called the winter melancholy. Men and women would sit for hours staring into flickering flames, their minds dulled by the endless grey days. Children born in winter often struggled more than their summer counterparts, their small bodies fighting battles against cold and darkness that many could not win. Yet perhaps most remarkably, it was during these darkest months that some of the most profound expressions of human creativity emerged. The long nights became canvases for storytelling, for the weaving of tales that would survive centuries. Mothers would gather their children close and speak of heroes who conquered impossible odds, of spring's inevitable return, of warmth and plenty that awaited beyond the winter's grip. These stories served a purpose far greater than mere entertainment. They were psychological armor against despair, threads of hope woven into the very fabric of medieval culture. The promise that winter, no matter how brutal, was not eternal became a cornerstone of medieval resilience. This cyclical understanding of hardship and renewal shaped not just how people survived winter, but how they understood life itself. The religious calendar, too, provided crucial psychological support during these dark months. The celebration of Christmas brought light and joy to the deepest part of winter, while Candlemas in February marked the first stirrings of spring's approach. These religious observances were not mere spiritual exercises but vital mental health interventions, giving people fixed points of hope and celebration when the natural world offered little comfort. Medieval winters also fostered a unique relationship with time itself. Unlike our modern world of constant activity and artificial light, winter imposed a natural rhythm of rest and contemplation. People learned to live with the seasons in ways we can barely comprehend today. They understood that winter was not an enemy to be conquered but a natural part of life's rhythm, a time for reflection, repair, and preparation for the year ahead. This acceptance did not make winter easier, but it made it bearable. Medieval people developed what we might call a seasonal psychology, understanding that human emotions and energy naturally ebbed and flowed with the changing year. They did not expect to feel the same in January as they did in June, and this realistic expectation may have protected them from some of the despair that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. The end of winter, when it finally came, was greeted with celebrations that seem almost primitive to our modern sensibilities. The first signs of spring, the earliest budding of trees, the return of migratory birds, were occasions for genuine joy and community celebration. These were not quaint customs but expressions of profound relief from months of genuine hardship and danger. Spring cleaning was not merely a practical necessity but a ritual purification, a way of sweeping out the accumulated darkness and staleness of winter. Homes were opened to fresh air for the first time in months, and people emerged blinking into sunlight like prisoners released from long captivity. The psychological impact of this seasonal transition cannot be overstated. It was literally a return to life from a kind of hibernation. The agricultural calendar that governed medieval life meant that spring brought not just warmth and light but urgent work. Fields needed plowing, seeds required planting, and the cycle of survival began anew. This immediate transition from winter's enforced idleness to spring's frantic activity served an important psychological function, channeling the energy and hope of survival into productive action. As we consider the full impact of medieval winters on human society, we begin to understand how profoundly these seasonal challenges shaped not just individual lives but entire civilizations. The need to survive winter drove innovations in agriculture, architecture, and social organization that would influence human development for centuries to come. The medieval experience of winter reminds us that human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of finding meaning and even beauty in the most challenging circumstances. These people faced hardships that would test the limits of modern endurance, yet they not only survived but created rich cultures, built magnificent cathedrals, and laid the foundations for the world we know today. Their winters were indeed brutal, filled with suffering and loss that we can barely imagine. Yet from this suffering emerged a deep understanding of human resilience, community solidarity, and the precious nature of life itself. The medieval winter was a crucible that forged character, tested faith, and ultimately revealed the indomitable nature of the human spirit. As we drift off to sleep in our warm, well-lit homes, protected by central heating and abundant food supplies, we can honor the memory of those who endured medieval winters by remembering their strength, their ingenuity, and their unwavering hope. Their legacy lives on not just in the structures they built or the traditions they established, but in the very fact that we are here today, descendants of people who refuse to be broken by winter's worst assaults. The story of medieval winters is ultimately a story about the triumph of human determination over seemingly impossible odds. It reminds us that no matter how dark or cold our own winters may seem, spring will come again, hope will return, and the human spirit will find a way to endure and flourish once more.